What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my fantasy football starts and sits for NFL Week 14.
Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon.
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to go over each position and give you my fantasy football starts and sits for NFL this week. This should help you decide who you want to start in your season-long fantasy football leagues. And we will show you how to use the Draft Dashboard tools to dominate your season-long fantasy leagues. You can find waiver wire targets, get player point projections, find the best positional matchups to see who is projected to score the most fantasy points this week. These tools will help you decide what players to start in your fantasy football leagues. We have it all right here, so let's get into it. Okay guys, NFL Week 14. Let's take a look at the quarterback position. I'm gonna start Philip Rivers from the Indianapolis Colts playing the Las Vegas Raiders, who have the 8th worst defense overall, and they give up the 8th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Philip Rivers has averaged 16.8 fantasy points per game on the season, but he scored 19, and 22 fantasy points in the last 3 games, projected at 17.6 fantasy points here in Week 14. And Vegas thinks there's going to be 50.5 points scored in this game, with the Colts favored by 2.5. So you got a great matchup, a high-scoring game, and a close, competitive game. And Philip Rivers has been playing really well in the past few weeks. So I'm going to start Philip Rivers here versus the Las Vegas Raiders. Okay, who are we going to sit in Week 14? I'm going to sit Derek Carr from the Las Vegas Raiders playing the Indianapolis Colts, who have a good defense overall, and they've been good versus opposing quarterbacks. Derek Carr has averaged 18.7 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 2.7 rush attempts per game. Now, although he had a big game last week, scored 36 fantasy points, he was playing the New York Jets, who don't have a good defense, especially versus the pass. But Derek Carr scored 5 fantasy points the week before that, so I don't think I can trust him here in Week 14, especially if your fantasy season depends on it, and especially versus this Indianapolis Colts defense. Now, Derek Carr is projected at 19 fantasy points here in Week 14, but I don't feel good about playing Derek Carr with my fantasy season on the line. I'm going to look to another quarterback if I can this week, so I'm going to sit Derek Carr here versus the Indianapolis Colts. Okay, let's take a look at the running back position. I'm going to start David Montgomery from the Chicago Bears playing the Houston Texans, who have the 5th worst defense overall, and they give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing running backs. David Montgomery has averaged 15.2 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 14.5 rush attempts per game and 4.6 pass targets per game. He scored 27 and 28 fantasy points in the last 2 games, projected at 14.7 fantasy points here in Week 14. Vegas thinks there's going to be 45.5 points scored in this game, and they have the Bears trailing by 1.5. But you got a fantastic matchup and a player that's been hot, so I like David Montgomery here versus the Houston Texans. Another running back I'm going to start is Wayne Gallman from the New York Giants playing the Arizona Cardinals, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, but they give up the 11th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Wayne Gallman has averaged 10.2 fantasy points per game on the season, but take a look at his last 3 games. He scored 17, 18, and 19 fantasy points off of 16, 24, and 18 rush attempts. So he's getting a ton of rushing volume with some pass targets mixed in. He's projected at 12.6 fantasy points here in Week 14, but I'm going to ride the momentum with Wayne Gallman He seems to be a big part of the New York Giants offense. He has a decent matchup. Vegas thinks there's going to be 45.5 points scored in this game, with the Giants trailing by 2.5. So you got a close, competitive game. So I'm going to start Wayne Gallman here versus the Arizona Cardinals. Okay, who are we going to sit here in Week 14? I'm going to sit Miles Sanders from the Philadelphia Eagles playing the New Orleans Saints, who have a good defense overall, and they give up the absolute fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs. Miles Sanders has averaged 13 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 13.1 rush attempts per game and 4.3 pass targets per game. But his production has been way down. He only scored 3, 6, and 10 fantasy points in the last 3 games, and he only got 10 and 6 rush attempts in the past 2 games. Now he's projected at 14.6 fantasy points here in Week 14, but he's got a tough matchup, and Vegas thinks this is going to be a low-scoring game. 45.5 points scored in this game, with the Eagles trailing by 6.5, so you don't have a running game script here. His rushing attempts are just way too low. He's not involved in the game plan, so I'm going to sit Miles Sanders here versus the New Orleans Saints.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all the tools for NFL. NBA is right around the corner. This is a great time to get in and try everything for 1 month. The tools are all about saving research time. You can see the last 3 games, the fantasy points per game, the targets they got per game, so you can see how involved they are in the offense, the rushes they got per game. Seeing all this stuff on one screen helps you save time and make better picks. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups.
Okay, let's take a look at the wide receiver position. I'm going to start Corey Davis from the Tennessee Titans playing the Jacksonville Jaguars, who have the worst defense overall, and they give up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Corey Davis has averaged 16.9 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 7 pass targets per game. He scored 38 fantasy points last week off of 12 pass targets. He's projected at 13.2 fantasy points here in Week 14, and Vegas thinks this is going to be a high-scoring game. 53.5 points scored in this game, with the Tennessee Titans favored by 7.5. So you got a fantastic matchup. So I like Corey Davis here versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. Okay, who are we going to sit at the wide receiver position here in Week 14? If you haven't done so already, I'm going to sit Travis Fulgham from the Philadelphia Eagles playing the New Orleans Saints, who have a good defense overall, and they've been middle of the pack defending opposing wide receivers. Travis Fulgham has averaged 11.9 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6.7 pass targets per game, but he scored 0, 4, and 2 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 2, 2, and 7 pass targets. He's projected at 8.3 fantasy points here in Week 14, but Vegas thinks this is going to be a low-scoring game. It's not a good matchup, so I'm going to sit Travis Fulgham here versus the New Orleans Saints. The other wide receiver I'm going to sit is Nelson Agholor from the Las Vegas Raiders playing the Indianapolis Colts, who have a good defense overall, and they've been good versus opposing wide receivers. Nelson Agholor has averaged 10.5 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 4.6 pass targets per game. Now, his pass targets and his production have been up the past 3 games, so I could see some people wanting to start Nelson Agholor, and he is projected at 11.3 fantasy points here in Week 14, but he's got a bad matchup, and if I don't like Derek Carr in this game, I certainly don't like Nelson Agholor, so I'm going to sit Nelson Aguilar here versus the Indianapolis Colts. Okay, moving on to the tight end position. I'm going to start Robert Tonyan from the Green Bay Packers playing the Detroit Lions, who have the third worst defense overall, and although they've been pretty good versus opposing tight ends, Robert Tonyan has averaged 11.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 3.9 pass targets per game. But take a look at his last 3 games. He scored 14, 18, and 15 fantasy points off of 5 pass targets in each of those games. He's projected at 9.2 fantasy points here in week 14. Vegas thinks there's going to be 55.5 points scored in this game, with the Packers favored by 7.5. So a super high scoring game here. This guy's getting good pass volume and excellent production. So I'm going to start Robert Tonyan here versus the Detroit Lions. Okay, what tight end are we going to sit here in week 14? I'm going to sit Dalton Schultz from the Dallas Cowboys playing the Cincinnati Bengals, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing tight ends. Dalton Schultz has averaged 9.5 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6 pass targets per game. He's projected at 8.3 fantasy points here in week 14, and we don't have the over-under total for this game yet, or at least at the time that I'm recording this video we don't, but they have the Dallas Cowboys favored by 3.5. This could be a Zeke Elliott game with a running game script. Andy Dalton hasn't really been that great lately, and the production of Dalton Schultz has fallen off lately, so I'm going to sit Dalton Schultz here versus the Cincinnati Bengals.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smickety smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NFL slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again and good luck.